good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Geek Syndicate. So what I'm doing is I'm continuing my little series of interviews, just kind of like catching up with people. A lot of them are peers of mine and friends of mine, people I kind of look up to. And obviously I couldn't get the person I really look up to most, so I had to settle for Corey Brotherson.
Thank you. I live to be second base.
Yeah, I was going to say, the person, obviously, my real hero was Yomi, but I couldn't get him, so I had to get you. Oh, I know, cold.
He'll love that. But that's a dagger in my heart. He knows I love him. So.
We've known each other now. I don't know now how long we've known each other for.
Probably since about 2007, 2008.
Yeah, something like that, yeah. I don't actually remember how we even first met. It was obviously at a comic convention, I would assume.
Yeah, I think it was one of those kind of. I think you and Dave were doing a panel or something, and I think it was this in Birmingham, and I ended up going to that panel, and I think we got chatting like round about then or after then, because I really liked I got introduced to you through a good friend, Matt Gibbs, and I think it was I really like the stuff that these guys are doing for Geek Syndicate, and it seems like good people to go and meet. So I think we got chatting round about then, and then obviously we kind of we started kind of talking and getting involved in each other's books and such like that.
Yes, because I think soon after I reviewed Magic of Myths, which I really enjoyed.
Yes, you did. Yes, thank you. Yes, I do remember. That was one of the first reviews. And I remember specifically getting that review and reading it and then going off in a very quiet corner of the office that I was working at the time and just doing like fist pumps and like silent cheering and everything. I was so happy. I was so happy about it.
It's not often I have that effect on people. People normally want to like get go into a corner and like hit me with a fist, not necessarily just fist bump the air. So, but for people who don't know you, do you want to just give us a brief introduction of who you are and what you have been up to?
Sure. I'm essentially a writer. I try to diversify my trade, but my primary trade really was video games editorial. I started off as a video games journalist. Way back in, I think it was 2002. And I've been in the games industry ever since. So I've been bouncing from company to company, did a little bit of freelance work, did some work for Yahoo. And I've been working for Sony PlayStation since then for nearly 12 years. I'm actually leaving at the end of April. And then I'll be freelancing again. So really, I've been kind of like doing a lot of stuff in the video games industry since I left university, which is a very, very long time ago now. I also started doing comic book work as well. So I got my first book published. I think it was about 2006, and that was in an anthology called Futurius by Dan Lundy, who was pretty much the writer, artist, and publisher of that entire line. And I was hired by him to do a short story. So I got on board at first, and that was like my first story that I got published. And that was during my freelance years. And I really I got a taste of it at that point. So I was hired to do a couple series that nothing ever happened with another company called Nuge. And I started writing my own stuff and eventually kind of bounced from publisher to publisher and managed to get picked up a few places, such as with the Unseen Shadows universe as well, where you hired me to write a couple stories for that, which I absolutely love doing. And since then, really, it's just been me trying to kind of do a lot of the stuff that I enjoy. So the main series that I write is Magic and Myths, which is like a urban fantasy mythological series that I co-created with my friend Sergio Calvet, who lives in Barcelona. And that's really been a staple. But at the same time, I've also been a kind of line editor and also adapting writer for Yomi's series, Clockwork Watch, which is this big steampunk transmedia epic, for lack of a better term. And more recently, I'm on the verge of launching an anthology, a woman-focused anthology called Deadlier, which is going to be launching at Comics Salapia in Shrewsbury on the 1st of June, if I recollect correctly. So I've spent a few years working on that, but it was I got a sniff of the convention at the time because I was speaking to the Walking Dead artist Charlie Adlard at the lake last year. Lovely guy, both him and his wife. brilliant, so nice. And he said, oh, well, this has got to be this new convention popping up in Shrewsbury. Keep an eye out for it, because it sounds like it'll be quite good. So they wanted to bring a kind of, I guess it was a pan-European feel to the UK with this particular convention, and really kind of make it open air and kind of very inclusive in terms of putting it outside as well as inside, so people in the town square could actually kind of walk by, which is very similar to a convention I went to in the Netherlands last year as well. So I thought it's actually a good opportunity to maybe launch the book there, and get it into the hands of people. At the same time, I'll be doing a pre-order thing, which at this moment in time, to get the book hopefully to people who are trying to want to jump the queue a little bit early. So hopefully they'll be able to get it in their hands just before then. But the primary launch will be at Salapia.
Okay, well, that's a nice link actually, because we had Shane on talk about Comet Salapia. I keep saying the name wrong. So yeah, and I said to Shane as well, like, I'm gutted because I can't. I really want to go, but I'm away. I'm away in Stockholm that weekend, so I can't make it. So I promised Shane I'm going to go next year, though, if it's on next year, because I think it's a great concept and a really clever idea, and it just seems to be something that I think the comic convention scene is starting to try to do different things. So this idea of like a comic festival, I really like the sound of it, but I've yet to kind of experience it. So I haven't done, I haven't been to Lakes. Dave's been to the one they do in France that Shane was talking about. That this was kind of the template they used. So so I'll be interested to get your feedback on as well when you've when you've launched Deadlier Dan, as to how it went down and how the whole event was.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about Deadlier Dan in a little bit. But my first question I wanted to ask you is, so obviously you've already said like your primary sort of focus is comic writing. And I know we've kind of had this discussion because obviously my primary focus, obviously outside the day job, is prose writing. And prose was something I kind of always wanted to do from the first story I wrote when I was 11 years old. I thought, yep, this is what I want. So was comic writing always your first sort of love in terms of a creative outlet?
Funnily enough, I feel like we're very, very similar because it was bizarre. During about 11 years old as well, up till about 11 years old, I wanted to be a doctor, and then something just changed inside of me. It was there was an awakening, as it was. I realized I really enjoyed writing, and I said, well, you know what, I love writing, I love reading. Let's try and focus on doing something in the writing craft when I leave school. So my first thoughts were, well, I buy a lot of comic books, I love comic books, let's see if I can do something in that. But as you all know as well, like back then, if you went to a careers advisor and you said, I want to do like games journalism or comic writing or write a book, and they'll just turn you go, nah. It's gonna happen, because there's no clear path. And back then, because there was no clear path, it was very much kind of like, well, we want to do our job, so we want to try and help you as best you can, but we can't help you if you're going to give us a job which is tantamount to saying you want to be an astronaut. So back then I thought, well, I would love to be a comic book writer, but I'll just write anything. So I started writing prose. I had no idea how to write a comic book at the time, because this was back in the 80s and 90s, early 90s, and I had no exposure to a comic book script. I barely knew how to write prose apart from the stuff that I was writing at school. And so I really just kind of focused on just honing my craft by just writing as much as I could. And again, because there was no internet back then, it was like you go to a library and you read books and you study, or that was it. There was no other way to access that knowledge, or there was very expensive courses that you could, like mail order courses that you could join up or what have you. But that was pretty much it. So I just continued writing. So when I went from school to sixth form and then university, what I found, I was writing kind of prose. I was writing stage plays as well. It was all awful. It was all really, really bad stuff. At the time, I loved doing it, and I was heavily inspired by anything I read, as as it is when you're first starting out. It's like you just become a melting pot of your inspirations and your sources. But I just enjoyed doing it. I just enjoyed writing. And it was only when I got to I think it was my early 20s, and I stumbled across a few publications that were talking about the craft of writing, but I also stumbled across, most importantly, Sandman, which I can't remember which trade it was, but it had a script in the back of it that Neil Gaiman decided that he wanted to put out there, because very few people were doing that at the time, because it was very much a almost like a magician's circle where no one wanted to talk about it. It was a hidden thing. So I read that and I was like, oh, okay. So obviously he said that this isn't the way to write a comic book, but it's one of the ways you can write it. So that ended up becoming my template as to how I wrote comic book scripts. And then from that point onwards, I thought, okay, maybe I can write comic books. But it wasn't until I was I was about 23 years old, and I had like a friend who was, when I was working for Yahoo, in fact, I had a friend who was working as a screenwriter on the side, and he had a contact with DC Comics. It was John Nee, who was I think it was the VP of, I think it was VP of Finance or Marketing or something at the time. And he said, just write a script to him. Write a script. I'll give you his contact details. And there you go. And so I dropped him an email, and we got talking briefly, and I kind of started writing comic book scripts. And from that point onwards, that became my main focus, to kind of really hone my idea of what I wanted to do as a writer, as a comic book writer. At that point, I'd already had about 3 years as a games journalist. So I was quite happy to do that as my main job and do comic book writing on the side. So yeah, it was after that point I've really kind of wanted to do more comic book writing. I wrote prose after that. I entered a short story competition, didn't get very far with it.
I think we've all done that. I entered a few short story competitions as well.
I think it's a rite of passage, isn't it? So
yeah.
Put it out there, and you hope that someone will go, oh, I really like this, and it will win something, and obviously it's like in my case in particular, it's like, oh, okay, it's actually quite shoddy. So I'll just continue writing my comic book scripts and hope that people like those instead. So yeah, I continued writing comic books, and I think my confidence in prose was a bit up and down. I was writing a lot of prose before that point anyway, right. But it was I was really trying to think to myself, let me go into comic book writing and see if anything comes from that, because I don't have I feel I don't have the craft in prose as of yet, and the confidence in prose as of yet to make something more of it.
I think it's that vicious cycle, isn't it? Because the more you do something, the more your confidence grows, but you kind of need to do more of it to get the confidence. So it's that sort of vicious cycle. Because on the flip side of that, I always kind of wanted to do comic writing, although that came much later on for me. I kind of wanted to do comic writing, and even when sort of we worked together and we, on sort of Unseen Shadow stories and stuff, I have a huge respect for one in the comic process as well. But as a writer, I have a ridiculous amount of respect for comic writers, because I cannot get my head around writing a comic. And I've been asked a couple of times, like, would I try writing a comic? And I'm like, every time I've tried, I've got about as far as like the first panel. And I'm like, right, what do I do now? Whereas, other people say, well, I don't understand how you can write so much. You can write a 200,000 sort of page novel, but you can't write a 22-page comic script. And I'm like, yeah, but in many ways, there's no difference. The only difference is girth. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's I think, and that's the thing, I because I don't have as much confidence in my prose, or at least I didn't up until like last year. I look to what you do with like Fallen Heroes and Forgotten Warriors, and I'm like, God damn, I'm not sure I'd be able to come anywhere near this sort of work and industry that comes into putting something else like this out, because it's such an incredible amount of work. And for me, it's like part of my brain would I can sit down and write a series of comic book stuff, and think it's relatively short, and then I'll look at a novel and go, nope, too much. I can't handle that, man. It's just too much. So for me, I'm hearing you say that, and I'm thinking to myself, yeah, man, but those novels are big. I can't handle that.
I suppose that's one way to look at it. You just hire someone though. You just get someone else in to you just come up with like the overall idea, and then you just get someone to kind of write the meat of it, and you just sort of come in and do like the cool stuff, like the dialogue beats and stuff like that. But kind of like, talking about what stuff that you're proud of and stuff like that. And actually, one of the questions I was going to ask you was how you learned the process of writing comic scripts, which is what you've already kind of explained. But do you remember what the first thing, and I'm not necessarily thinking about Magic and Myths or Deadlier or Clockwork Watch, but do you remember the first thing that you wrote that you felt that, I'm proud of this? It doesn't matter even, whether it was something you did when you were 11, which, technically may not be your best work, but it's the thing that you wrote that, like, I'm proud of that.
I think there were probably a couple things. So the first one was when I was in probably my second year of my English language and literature degree, and one of the modules was fiction writing. Mm-hmm. So I sat down and I wrote a story, and I'll tell you what the story is about. I'll give it some context because I sat down and I wrote it, and I was like, I'm so happy about this story. It's really, really good. I really enjoy it. And I got a decent grade for it. But what I didn't realize was that I'd basically taken the influence of Neil Gaiman that Neil Gaiman had on me and rewrote part of a I guess a section of what Sandman was. It wasn't a sense of like plagiarizing it or anything like that. So the story was that every year William Shakespeare would meet up. No, sorry, not William Shakespeare. Sorry. Every year Loki and I think it was Puck from British kind of classic mythology, in terms of Midsummer Night's Dream, would meet up and decide to play a prank on humanity. I'm trying to remember this story now because it's so long ago. They ended up going to a bar. They ended up going to this pub, and they made a deal with Kit Marlowe, who was in the pub with Shakespeare at the time.
All right.
And it ended up leading to Kit Marlowe's death, who I think, if my history is correct, he was stabbed one night. And I sat back and I wrote this story, and I was like, I really enjoyed writing it. I'm really proud of it. And, it got a decent grade. And afterwards, I realized that what I was doing was I took the element of Loki from Neil Gaiman's Sandman, and there was another character he met as well. After I think it was I think it was an element of effectively Lucifer, and basically take that element of two really well-known or relatively well-known characters from different stories and mythology, putting them into a bit of a blender, giving them a common kind of bond, and then throwing them into a scenario where they have to talk to other writers. And there was this element of in Sandman where there was actually a storyline where Morpheus, the main character, makes a deal with Shakespeare. And that's the part that was kind of like becomes an explanation as to why his stories were so good and why they became timeless and inspirational. Right. And what I did subconsciously was basically take that element of Shakespeare meeting this character and remixed it essentially and put my own spin on it and threw more characters into the element. And even though Shakespeare wasn't a big part of the story that I wrote, it was very much a sense of like almost what would happen if that sort of strand of thinking was continued. But like I said earlier before, it was all my inspirations were put into a blender, and it was very much my inspirations of mythology and Neil Gaiman all kind of thrown in, and that ended up becoming the template for what Magic and Myths ended up becoming.
I was just going to say, I could definitely hear a Magic and Myths. I was also going to say that would make for a great Netflix show.
Yeah, you could see them picking up something like that.
Joe, you want to write that down as a pitch, mate, and get that into Netflix.
I'm putting a stamp on that right now.
That's got a whole kind of Ocean's 11 sort of vibe to it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. so, so yeah, I did end up kind of like revisiting that kind of that element of storytelling in Magic and Myths in itself, but I really wanted to acknowledge the fact that that was where I kind of started off. So, but even then, I was very proud of the work that I did on that particular time at that moment in my life. And when I was a bit more experienced in writing, still wouldn't say I was great, but the one thing that I was really proud of at the time when I was still kind of starting up was a story called it was a story called Butterflies and Moths, which initially was supposed to be a series of short stories, essentially, because I was having difficulties trying to find artists that wouldn't go missing on me and have a lack of communication. So I thought, what if I actually wrote a story which involved 3 or 4 stories in itself, which were kind of like effectively one-page stories, and they had like a spine of one person effectively talking and telling these stories to another person. And I thought that would allow me to have a different artist per story, which would hopefully cut down on any issues that I have with any artists deciding that they didn't want to communicate with me anymore, or they had personal issues or whatever happens. And I wrote it, and I was really, really happy with it. And inevitably, nothing ever happened with it. Because ironically enough, the artist that I was working with at the time went missing.
Oh, okay.
So I ended up struggling to find other artists. And that wasn't the actually end of Butterflies and Moths, because what ended up happening was I ended up rewriting part of it into a graphic novel idea, which was picked up by a publisher at the time, Insomnia Publishing. They really liked the idea. So this was back in, again, 2008, I think it was. And they really liked the idea, but they said, how about you write a short story using the same character at first, just so we get kind of example of not only what your writing is like, but also an introduction for the audience to kind of get into the mode of the story. So I ended up writing like a little, almost effectively a prelude to the short story of stories that I wrote initially before. And that ended up going into the anthology that Insomniac was actually doing, called Leia. Oh, it's called, I think it was Layer Zero.
Yeah, it was, yeah. Layer Zero Volume 1 or something.
That was it, yeah. So I ended up putting it into that. And then they were like, we really like it. We will give you the green light to do the graphic novel. So that's when I actually got paired with Jenny, or Yenny as an anglicized name is pronounced. I really need to get used to pronouncing it correctly for her. And she became my co-creator for Butterflies and Moths, the graphic novel. So I ended up writing the entire graphic novel after that point. And obviously the publisher ended up folding and nothing came of it. And it's something that we kind of put in the drawer and for the time being. But it all goes back to that one story that I did that I was really, really happy with. And I thought it was a very, at the time, I was only in like my mid-20s. And I thought, oh, this is a really mature story and it captures everything I want to say. It wasn't necessarily a mature story looking back at it now, but it did capture how I felt at the time, and what I was feeling at the time was a lot of pain. I was in a really dark place, and it really encapsulated the pain that I was going through at the time. And I was actually very happy with it, to the point where I feel like even if I were to go back to start rewriting Butterflies and Moths, which I really should at some point, I wouldn't have to do too much tweaking for that particular part of the story, because I feel it gets across what I wanted to say at the time, and probably what I still want to say, even 15 years down the line.
Well, to come full circle, obviously you are about to, because I know you've been hitting the market in hardcore. You're about to launch a new, your new graphic novel anthology, which is Deadlier Dan.
Yeah.
To read the blurb before I get you to tell us a bit more about it, you've got a collection of 4 women-focused sci-fi/fantasy tales created by some of the best and upcoming creators in the indie scene. Story, do you know what? I'm not going to attempt to. I'm just going to say Jenny. Jenny Gilbert. She'll kill me when she sees me. Olivia Sampson, collaborated with Ted Brandt with Kit Buss, all written by yourself. do you want to kind of tell us a bit more about it before we get into? So before you do that, what I'll say is that I read Deadlier Down today. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought it was a great read, mate. And also, I think what's really difficult, I think, with doing an anthology is difficult enough anyway. You know, I've got a little bit of experience on that front. But I think to have an anthology which is written by one person and yet to have those stories feel so dramatically different, but at the same time have this sort of unifying thread, which we'll talk about in a bit, I thought was brilliant. The fact that you were able to get me invested and rooting for a spider, given the fact that, as you know, I am arachnophobic, that in itself, when I opened it and the first story was about a spider, I was like, is he having a laugh?
Sorry, I should have probably warned you about that.
he set up this whole thing just to wind me up. Do you know what I mean? And yeah, by the end of it, and I don't want to, obviously I'm not going to spoil it, but yeah, by the end of it, I was proper rooting for the spider. And that's probably the highest praise that I can give you, is that Brian Nugent says I was rooting for the spider, Geek Syndicate. Do you know what I mean? That's all I can say. You know what I mean?
I'll put that on the cover on. No, thank you. I really appreciate that. It's I'm very grateful for that. To be fair, I'm not a big fan of spiders myself, even though my nickname at school was Spider. And when I got the artwork back from Jen actually on that, because she did the artwork for that particular story, I was like, this is a little bit too realistic for my liking. It looks a bit too much like a spider, which I know sounds counterproductive, but yeah, it was a little bit too close at first. I thought, no, let's fight the fear, just go with it. It's good.
Yeah, and although the spider is fantastic in the comic, I don't ever want spiders to get that level of intelligence in real life, because we're done for if they do.
Yeah, I've come across too many intelligent spiders as it is, and yeah, I'm with you right there, man. I'll get the flamethrower. I'll bear the whole place down if I ever come across something like that. It's not right. It's really not right. Even if they're coming up to me and saying, yeah, I really like that story you did in Deadlier, Dan. It's really inspirational and it puts us in a really good light. I'll be like, sorry, just throw the match. I'm gone. I'm glad you liked it, but
yeah.
See ya.
Also, why are you talking to me? You're a spider.
Yeah. They don't talk to you? I mean, yeah. I mean, I talk to them all the time, and they talk right back. And
they don't even come. They don't even come within 20 miles of this house. They know the score. Yeah, I'm like that old man I'm like that old man like in a Scooby-Doo cartoon where like the kids don't go to his house. Do you know what I mean? I'm like that for spiders. Like, no, don't go up there, man. That dude will F you up if you go in there. We sent Bobby in there last week. He ain't no one seen him since. Do you know what I mean? Anyway, enough about my arachnophobia. Tell us a bit more about Deadlier Dan, sir.
So the idea was to initially have actually 3 stories, 3 being the magic number, as it were. Ended up being 4, which I'll get to at some point later. So the first story is called The Cure for Fire, and that's very much a fantasy sci-fi kind of adventure. And it's about a young warrior who is very gifted at taking lives in this huge war, that they're in this war against these mechanical beings. And she's exceptionally gifted at basically being a killer, but she's only like 17 years old. And one day something happens which causes her to be outcasted from her clan. And so she's sent off to find a cure for her, what is seen to be as an illness, essentially, which sets her on a path which changes her entire life in the process. The second story is called The Flower Girl, and that is essentially, I think, a little bit like Hellboy sort of thing. So you take MI5 and you add a supernatural spin to it, where this young lady who is suffering from an acute sense of identity crisis for various reasons in the story itself, and she's tasked to hunt down this kind of supernatural murderer, but she's having to deal with a sense of not knowing who she is and where she came from, essentially, for one reason or another. And obviously that becomes a metaphor in itself. So that's really more kind of like a James Bond kind of urban fantasy sort of story. The third story is called Transient Blues. Now, this is more kind of pulpy sci-fi. Think kind of Flash Gordon, but instead of having, your mid-20s something male, we've actually got a woman who is actually a former enlistee, a Dutch lady who is actually now in her 60s, and she's still having to do, fight the good fight. She's still having to go out there and fight despots and tyrants, but she's suffering from the same illnesses that everybody suffers from when you get to that age, especially if you've put your body through those sorts of extreme dangers and kind of elements, essentially. So she's got shakes in her hands. She feels that her mind isn't as sharp as it was before. And the question that comes from that story is, what do you do when you're in your kind of like effectively your twilight years, as it were, when you're fighting the good fight, you're still out there battling away, and your mind and your body is starting to turn against you. What happens when you reach a point where it's like, where you have to say, what can I do next? And then the final story, which is pretty much spliced between the other three stories, is called She, which is basically my illustrated prose kind of fabulous story, which is the spider story that we were talking about before, where this five-legged spider is trapped in this huge walled garden, and she can't escape. And she's basically being mocked. She's being mocked for the fact that she's got only 5 legs. She's being mocked for the fact that she's trapped in itself, and everybody, the birds and the butterflies that she comes across, can literally fly over the wall and go wherever they want to. And she wants to get out. She wants to experience the world, but she has no way of doing that. So it really is a story about effectively about privilege, about how creatures and people themselves will abuse privilege, and that whether that's unconscious or conscious privilege, but also how we as people, whether you're dealing with disability or some form of disadvantage, are basically treated, and how we try to deal with that going forward and try and live our lives. So all of these stories have an element of that within them, where we're dealing with effectively 4 marginalized women, or in the spider's case, a female spider, or marginalized, or having to deal with difficulties in their lives because they're being outcasted in some way or another, and having to find themselves, but also having to find what the next chapter of their lives are in a world which is constantly telling them that they either shouldn't do this or they shouldn't be this, and they need to be able to conform, which obviously in a perfect world shouldn't be the case, but that's what these stories are essentially about.
My sort of takeaway from it, I thought all the stories were great. All the stories were had a kind of an edge to them, a kind of darkness to them, but the overall theme that I got running through the whole, I suppose the backbone of the whole anthology, was this idea of acceptance and hope. Yes. Accepting who you are, and the hope that actually you can strive to be anything you want to be and do anything that you want to do. Was that idea, that sort of core concept, was that something that was there from its inception? Because sometimes I found when you're coming up with story ideas and stuff, is that your core theme doesn't necessarily come out to begin with. Sometimes it comes out as you actually write the story. You then realize, oh, my theme is this, and then sometimes you will craft your story around that. And sometimes you literally start with, I want my story to be about hope, and then you move from there. And I didn't know where it was for you.
I think it was a bit of the latter, where it was only after when I was working through the stories that I realized that they all had a sense of hope and a level of understanding who they were and how they felt they should do what they should do to go forward, for good or for ill, but understanding that in themselves is not a reflection of how the world may see them or want them to be. So when I a little bit of background in that respect, when I first started writing Deadlier Dan, it wasn't really, the concept itself didn't exist. The idea was that I was going to write a story specifically for Kit, actually, who is the colorist of the Cure for Fire story. So, I mean, Kit is a fantastic artist. Every single person who's worked on this book is an amazing talent in their own right.
Yeah.
And at the time, I've known Kit for maybe a year or so. She joined PlayStation, where I was working, where I'm currently working, and she showed some artwork. And funnily enough, it's like her and Emma Vicelli, who were really, really good friends.
Oh, okay.
And they met each other through Snowdrop Studios. And obviously Emma at the moment is doing oh God, she's doing a lot of really, really big stuff at this moment in time. Life is Strange 2, I think she's currently working on.
Yes, she is, yeah.
And I sat down, I saw Kit's work, and I said, this is fantastic. This is really, really good stuff. It'd be really good to work with you, as I do with pretty much any artist that I come across. I try to pitch you immediately and say, you're working with me in the future. I don't care if you don't want to. Yeah. And thankfully she agreed. So the first story, which was The Cure for Fire, I actually sat down and specifically wrote that for her. And it was a story which was me experiencing depression at the time. I was going through basically several horrible breakdowns because I'd been dealing with depression and not realizing that I had depression, so it was left untreated. And it was only to the point where I literally woke up one morning and I was forgetting words and I was slurring my speech. And as a writer, you can imagine that's horrifying. It's absolutely terrifying, because words are what you have. If you don't have them anymore, it's like you can't be a writer anymore. And at that point, my wife was like, she was my girlfriend at the time, but my wife turned around to me and said, you need to go to the doctor. You need to see somebody about this. And so I started kind of getting treatment and going through therapy and taking antidepressants and all sorts. And during that period of time, during the early stage of that, I'd been writing The Cure for Fire, and that was my way of dealing with the depression at the time. And it was my way of expressing how society not only sees depression, but also how they feel they should treat it, which is not necessarily a good thing at the time. So I wrote that story, and it became a very dark, foreboding and grim story. And obviously, without giving anything away, it became very much a linchpin for how I was feeling. And at that point, I realized that I really probably should, if I'm going to publish this story, I probably should either get some more stories to go with it and do a larger thing, at least from a practical perspective of printing, because printing a short story is quite expensive in comic books.
Yeah.
So I thought if I pair it with some other stories as well, then maybe I can just do a larger book and maybe go along that way. So I actually ended up looking at one of the stories that I wrote for a competition about a year before that, and that was Transient Blues. In the end, I approached it, I rewrote it, expanded it a bit more, took some of the themes that I wanted to kind of really explore, and changed that. And I had a lot of difficulty with that story. I ended up rewriting it right up until the point where the story had actually been drawn, and I ended up rewriting it at that point because I still wasn't happy with it. And I think at that point as well, when I rewrote it, I'd actually already written The Flower Girl, and I'd written like a good portion of She as well. So funnily enough, Transient Blues started to get that through line a little bit more at the end of it, because I had rewritten it so much at that point, and I'd understood what I was trying to do with the rest of the stories. But during that kind of like first couple drafts, the ending was generally the same, but there was a different kind of element to it, which was how the characters got to that ending. And the two themes that came out between Transient Blues and The Cure for Fire at that point was effectively trying to deal with a sense of betrayal of sorts, whether that's betrayal from society or betrayal from within. So those became a kind of common theme. And when I wanted to write the first story, which was The Flower Girl, I went into that story with that in mind, where this young lady who was feeling like she was ostracized by the fact that she didn't know where she came from and didn't really understand her history, and was surrounded by adverts. I don't make a big thing of it in the story, but she's living in London and she's on the tube, and people who are looking at the story may not necessarily notice this at first, but there are adverts throughout that period of when she's on the tube, in the London tube, that are constantly talking about, get a beach body and make your lips look amazing. And it's all these kind of like women focused adverts about improvement and self-improvement that are more than likely done by men. And so there's this kind of subconscious element that runs throughout that story where it's just like men are constantly telling her what to be and what to do. So again, it became that sense of betrayal. It's like her only tether to her history and her background is a woman that she cannot find, and also a society which is constantly telling her that she needs to be something more and something better. So it was that common theme. And so when I got to She, it became a point where I was like, okay, I know what this is now. I know how the theme is going to run from. This is going to be a character who's going to feel like she's betrayed by something and other people and her environment. And the story becomes how she deals with that and how she manages to get around that. And funnily enough, I only realized that the hope aspect of those stories were all coming through towards the end of last year, when John Reppion, who is a writer and married to Leah Moore, they do some amazing stuff. And John was talking about how on Twitter, actually, how hope should be something that would hopefully become something more prominent within stories. And people took this entirely the wrong way for some reason, as people do on Twitter and social media. It's crazy. But after reading that and talking to him about it on Twitter as well, I sat down and I was going through Deadlier down in the stages of editing it. And I was like, oh my God, all these stories end in a sense of hope and a sense of acceptance one way or another. Even if that acceptance comes with a begrudging sense of, I want to change things, but I will change things the way that I want to change them eventually. So it was only at that point that I realized that all these stories are written with that perspective, totally from a subconscious point of view, which is, I guess, ironic in one way, because they all came from me being in pain in one way or another, or me dealing with a sense of disenchantment with myself or society or the environment around me. But clearly there was a subconscious element of hope fighting its way throughout, because even the story, which I'm not going to mention it because I don't want to give anything away, but even the story which ends on the most ambiguous note, even that ends on the sense of hope, because the question is not answered and she's given a strand of hope, and it's up to the reader as to whether she takes it or not. So I did end up finding my very long answer is I didn't end up finding an element of hope by the end of it, only in the editing process when I was realizing that that's what it was, because up until that point, the main through line of all of those stories was me fighting against something in itself.
Yeah, and I think we've spoken about, not just here, we've spoken many times down the years about both our varying battles with mental health, especially I think mental health and creativity seem to just almost go hand in hand, I definitely felt reading this that it almost felt like you could give this to someone who is struggling with mental health, or a better way to put it, struggling with their mental health, and as a kind of, it's not a guide, it's not a self-help comic, it's not a, if you read this is going to, solve your problems. But I think it almost feels, in a really roundabout way, it almost feels kind of, especially knowing you, almost slightly autobiographical in kind of that you've been able to take your own experiences and put them in settings that are completely different from your own surroundings, which I guess is what most creative people do. They kind of take their passions, their pains, and they put them on the page in some shape or form, and in many ways in a completely different environment. But if you know the person, you can kind of see what their journey is by reading that story. And I certainly got that reading Deadlier Dan. Each story, there's a point where you could have ended it where, for me, it would have become, still would have been really good, but it would have been effectively a Tells of the Unexpected or Outer Limits type story. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah.
Where there's like there's a sting in the tail.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? But what you did was, rather than do that, you've left people with light at the end of the tunnel as opposed to the sting in the tail. So you can't, and you can see those points in each story. You can see, this is a sting in the tail. And then you go on that little bit longer to sort of go, yes, that is, but then here's this bit of light. This is what I want to leave you with. And you're right, most of the tales have a kind of ambiguous end to them, which is what I quite like. I quite like the idea that you leave the reader to sort of mull over your story and take away what they need to take away from it. That's the question I was going to ask, actually. Now, obviously, the copy that I got hasn't got the foreword on it, has it?
Yes. No, not yet.
Yeah. Now, I believe is the foreword being done by Rihanna Pratchett?
Yes. So, I still have difficulty in believing this is actually a thing. I approached her. I mean, Deadlier has been delayed for effectively 2 years. This has been a very long project in the process of making, because it was supposed to be launched back about 2 years ago. And I approached her about 2.5 years ago because we're part of a writing group. We're both part of the same writing group that I'm in. And I thought it was a long shot, to be honest. I said, I've got nothing to lose by just politely sending her an email and asking her if she'd be interested. I really like her work. I've got a lot of respect for her, and especially the sort of diversity of craft that she has. And to my absolute surprise, she was just like, well, yeah, sure. Send me over some stuff. And I was like, what? Okay. Right. And yeah, she was absolutely lovely. So, and she's been incredibly patient because, like I said, the book's been delayed for 2 years. And I went basically cap in hand every 6 months. And I'd go, hey, Rihanna, I'm really, really sorry, but I've got some bad news and the book's been delayed. And if you still want to be the forward writer, it'd be great. But I'd understand if you just wanted to drop out. And every single time she's come back and said, actually, no, it's okay. Just keep me updated. It's all good. Thank you. So she's been incredible, and she's in the process of writing it right now.
Okay.
So, I mean, she's still got time to back out. So, she still could turn around.
I'm sure that's not going to happen, dude.
I hope not, but like I said, she's been incredible about this whole thing, and so she's in the process of writing it at the moment, and hopefully she'll get something over to me relatively soon. But yeah, I'm absolutely staggered that she's taken the time out and had so much patience and been so wonderful with this whole thing, and still wanting to write the foreword for it. So yeah, I'm very, very grateful to Rihanna.
That's fantastic, man. So this is a question because I know you do a lot of the process yourself. You obviously do the creative process because you're a writer, but also you will do the marketing as well as the selling because, we often cross paths at conventions. And so the question I wanted to ask you is, what do you find the hardest part of the creative process? Because in many ways, I consider the creating, the marketing and the selling, if you're a creator, all kind of part and parcel, really.
Oh, I definitely think, and this is going to be ironic because I work in marketing, but the marketing part, I've learned a lot actually working in marketing for PlayStation, as it were, because effectively the writing that I do is a form of marketing, but getting exposure to all that. But I still find it exceptionally difficult. I don't think I entirely understand it. And what I find is that I get caught in this self-defeating loop where I will put stuff out there on social media, because obviously that is the freest and sometimes the most effective form of marketing that you can have, especially if you've got very little budget or no budget in my case. And it's you put stuff out there and sometimes it's just like you get crickets. You just get this yourself echoing constantly. And quite recently, actually, during this whole marketing campaign that I'm doing for it, I found myself thinking, am I doing something wrong? Is it something that am I not writing the copy very well? Am I pushing it into the wrong areas? Am I publishing stuff at the wrong time? is the quality of the of anything that I'm doing just simply not enough? Because the artwork, I'm working with these absolutely incredible artists, and I've got like Mike Stock, who is the letterer and kind of book designer, essentially, like behind me. I have all these people behind me doing this phenomenal work, and I will put it out there to kind of get an interest and get people to hopefully put down some money in for a pre-order.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's like I'm not getting anything. I'm not getting it back. And if the work that I'm putting out there, the artwork and the production work is amazing from the likes of all the artists that have worked on it, from Jen, Olivia, Kit, Ted, and Megan, and all these works are going out there and it's looking incredible, then surely the fault must be at my door, because it can't be them, because that work is fantastic and everyone says that work is fantastic. So I start second guessing myself. I start wondering if there's any other way I can be more effective in the marketing, because it feels a bit like back in the day where DC wouldn't be able to create a really popular and successful Superman or Batman movie up until like Chris Nolan sort of thing. I mean, you had like obviously the Christopher Reeve Superman movies that came out, and they were amazing. And then after that, they really struggled to create a successful Superman story. And it's like after Christopher Nolan, Batman was also a bit shaky. And even before Christopher Nolan, there was that shakiness after the Tim Burton days. And you look at it and you're like, okay, these are two of the most successful and iconic IPs and characters in the world. Why are they not being bigger deals? Why aren't they succeeding in the way that they should be succeeding? And so I look at the work that I do in the marketing section of things, and I'm like, I have got some of the best artists and letterers and designers working with me on this stuff. Why isn't it reaching a wider audience? Why aren't people responding to it in a way that I think is justifiable for the talent that's gone out there?
Yeah.
So I do struggle a little bit with that, and I find it difficult. I find it difficult sometimes selling the work as well, because I had to get over that barrier of having to talk about my work in a way which has to be very self-complimentary.
Yes. Yeah.
You don't talk about it in a good way, then you don't expect people to buy it. And that's just classic marketing. That's marketing 101. But it's getting past that barrier of kind of thinking to yourself, oh God, is it any good? Or I can only see the flaws in this. And then talking to people or writing about it and really trying to talk it up and make a big deal of it. Because whenever you create anything, it should be a big deal. It started off from virtually nothing, if not nothing at all. You're suddenly creating something into the world. So that does become a challenge for me to do. I've got a bit better at it, but I struggle with the marketing, and sometimes the sale is definitely a point where I'm like, oh God, how can I big this up a little bit more? Which is part of the reason why the blurb on the back of the book is a little bit kind of shall we say, kind of, I guess, trumpet blowing, shall we say? The brightest and best up and coming indie stars and stuff like that. And to be fair, the artists that I work with are some of the best out. I can't deny that. They're fantastic. But it was really like my wife and several of her friends were like saying, you need to put this stuff out there, because if you put it out there, people will respond to it. If you go in there with your head down and kind of like, please, you buy my book, then they won't have confidence in it, because you don't have confidence in yourself. So I have difficulty with it, but I'm trying my hardest to be better.
Yeah, it is. I really struggle with the marketing side of things. And like you say, and it is that I can very much be, please sir, can I have some more? And it is getting over that, and and sort of, like you say, having confidence in your own work. But as we both have discussed that many times, when you're that sort of person that struggles with those sort of concepts, and to a certain extent, one of the reasons I became a writer was so I wouldn't have to talk to people. Do you know what I mean? That it can be a real kind of hurdle to overcome. And I think the thing with social media, to be honest, to sort of take what you were saying before about why aren't people, more invested in it. The way I've had to come to a bit of a understanding with social media, in that I just now look at social media now as just the Atlantic Ocean, or like the Pacific Ocean. and all I've got is a bottle where I've literally scrawled on a bit of paper, buy my book because it's great, and I've put it in the bottle and I've thrown it out into the water, and if I'm lucky, someone passing the rowboat will pick it up and read it and go, oh, I quite like the sound of that, and maybe they'll pass it on to the next person. Or if I'm really lucky and I'll throw it out, it will be a massive cruise liner ship will pass it by, and then suddenly it's got to like hundreds of thousands of people. You just, I think there's just no rhyme or reason to it.
Yeah, no, it's the perfect analogy. It is the perfect analogy right there. You've hit it right on the head, because that's how it feels. Exactly how it feels.
But I think if you don't do anything, then all you're doing is sitting at a beach looking at the ocean.
Absolutely, so it's just doing something.
Yeah. Anyway, so my last question before we round up. So I know off air we often talk quite a bit about the UK comic scene. Its ups and downs. So what I wanted to ask you, sort of put you on the spot, if you could change 3 things about the current UK comic scene, what would they be?
Wow, that's a tough question. That is a very tough question. Okay, so I reserve the right to change my mind at some point after the interview is over.
Okay. I won't hold you to it. It's fine. I won't get T-shirts printed saying these are Corey's 3 things about what he would change in the UK comic scene.
Yeah, these aren't necessarily set in stone. So I guess the first thing would be an element of, I think this actually very much a metaphor for not only Britain, but I'm from Birmingham. And this is definitely a Brummie thing, but I've noticed it as a general British thing as well. So the first thing I would say is that we need to feel like we are significant within the comic book industry. I think there's kind of like a little brother or a little sister kind of feel within the industry itself, in the comic book industry, to like movies, for example. But you pair that down to, say, British and American comics, and British comics or British creators as well, tend to feel like, oh, the American comics have this wide distribution from Diamond, and they've got wider territories, and they've obviously got all the big publishers out there, and so on and so forth, and it's really difficult over here by comparison. And so it becomes not necessarily a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it does become difficult for us as a British comic book community to be able to really fulfill the potential that I think is there and has been fulfilled at various times. You look at some of the big creators in the mainstream, and there's plenty of Brits out there making big waves in the American mainstream comic book community in itself. But I feel like it's very difficult for us as a British comic book community to be able to make those waves without having to get to that point, without having to go to an American publisher and say, hey, we've got something really cool here. We've got a lot of talent. Can you publish this book? And that's a shame, because there are some really nice, really good publishers out there, British publishers out there, and they don't get the market and the wideness of distribution that they deserve. So it is really, really hard. And I think that feeds into our self-confidence, or our sense of confidence, where we feel like, we'll always be, or at least in the foreseeable future, we'll always have that difficulty of being as big as what could be out there. So there is a sense of, I guess, institutionalized difficulties that come with that. But yeah, I would love for the industry to be able to change that and really value the British comic book community as it should be. And then for us to be able to step outside of that, at least break the glass ceiling that seems to be there for us, and be able to kind of toot our own horn a little bit more, and to be able to go out and really take that self-effacing and self-depreciating nature that we sometimes can have, and say, actually, you know what, we're putting some fantastic stuff out there, and we deserve to have maybe a bigger seat at the table that is currently existing out there. So yeah, I think personally, that would be something that I would love to see changed in the wider community in itself. The second thing I think is a bit of offshoot off that, and that is and this is I think this is in every single comic book community and also every single entertainment community as well. But you do tend to have these elements of, I guess, pockets, kind of almost cliques in itself, where if it's difficult to reach a certain level of exposure, then sometimes you'll have people who will feel like they need to protect that. And so as a result, you will not necessarily be pushed away, but the walls may come up a little bit more than what you would expect, especially for a smaller community that is within itself. And the comic book community is, on a whole, very, very small, exceptionally small, but it's full of great people. It's full of amazing people, full of friendly people, and people that all want to do the same thing, which is effectively create fantastic comics.
Yeah.
You don't comic book community and you don't go into the comic book industry to make money, because chances are we're all out here struggling to rub two pennies together to get these things off the ground. And it sometimes feels like, I think probably the best analogy I can think of is when, I can't remember who said this, whether it was Kurt Busiek or another big name writer, and they said when they were trying to break in, one of the things that they found was that for anyone breaking into the comic book industry, you would find yourself, once you found that way to get in, that way would then be closed off to everybody else, because the industry would then decide that actually we don't want people getting in that way, or that's the way that we prefer not to get in. And so like the guards effectively close around the hole where everyone's got into the castle after that point. And it can feel like that sometimes on a more kind of smaller scale, where it's like you'll have a sense of like people who are maybe doing really well for themselves. They'll want to put the feelers out there, but they'll very much keep the feelers within a closed circle. And it feels like, oh, okay, if someone does get into that circle, then that hole is then suddenly covered up again. And as soon as you get to it, you crawled over to it through hell and high water, and you get to it and it's like, oh man, I can't get in anymore. I'm going to have to find another way.
The opening.
Yeah. And sometimes it does feel like that, at least from my experiences and my perspective. So again, it'd be great if something like that would improve and feel wider and more accepted. I personally feel like I've constantly banged my head off a brick wall for a very, very long time, and I've been having to try and change my position in the wall and put a bit of pillow padding on my forehead, and then try and find a new way to get in. And so I'm desperately trying to kind of think of new tactics or what have you to try and be able to break down those barriers. And it goes back to the marketing thing as well. Sometimes I feel like, oh well, I could put stuff out there, but I haven't earned enough points, or I haven't got enough brownie points at that point accumulated to get the attention that may be there. So yeah, it is something that I feel, and I know I've got other friends within the industry as well that feel very similar as well. And it'd be amazing for more of those doors to be more open and everyone to throw the ladder and the bit of rope back down to people trying to get their way back up. And I've been fortunate enough to have met some lovely people who are actually in really high places recently, to be able to at least kind of give me a little bit of a hand and kind of say, kind of give a bit of a leg up. I mean, I'm basically talking about people who've provided blurb for Deadlier Dan. So that's effectively Leah Moore, Heather Antos, and Kieran Gillen, who are all absolute salt of the earth, brilliant people who have given me the time of day to be able to say nice things about the book. And as a result, hopefully that will open up a few more doors. But for, the three of them plus Rihanna that have done that, there have been the better part of 12 other people, if not 15 to 20 other people who I've approached who didn't even bother responding to my email. So it is what it is. You just try your best and you try to put your best foot forward, and hopefully people respond to that, and hopefully the circle will open up and wider. And if anyone has the bizarre idea of feeling like I'd be able to help them with something similar, like with pull quotes or like that, I'll be more than happy to extend myself down to that as well. It doesn't devalue their book. We're going back to the self-depreciating thing again. So that'll be the second thing. The third thing, wow. I'm trying to think what the third thing would be. There are so many things which I feel the industry on a whole should probably change, but that would be getting exceptionally political. What would the third thing be? I guess there's a certain element of I feel like I'm repeating myself a little bit here, so apologies if that's the case. But I think there's a certain element of the industry feeling like there's not an abundance out there, and what I mean by that is that we have to, when it comes to conventions and such, we feel like there's incredible conventions that are throughout the year, throughout the country, which is like, Fort Ball and MCM and the Lakes and now Salapia and Birmingham and so on and so forth. And for me, whenever I look at some of these conventions, especially the ones that are very comic book focused in itself, there is these conventions which they do amazing things and they create an incredible exposure. And I do feel like they don't get the credit that they're deserved. And I do feel that is reflective of the British industry in itself, the comic book industry in itself. So like I say, this is really much going back to the first thing that I was mentioning.
Yeah.
It's something that I feel like there are other entertainment industries, British entertainment industries in itself, that could be maybe helping more and actually helping kind of progress that sense of crossover appeal. Yeah. And it's less of a problem now where I think comic books are more accepted, but there's still, bizarrely enough, a sense of comic books being not necessarily a slum entertainment medium by comparison to movies and TV. But again, there is a sense of feeling like, oh, well, we're only comic books by comparison. And that sometimes feels like it does come through more. And I think it's like, if it comes through more and we're feeling like we're saying that more, then it's going back to that confidence thing. If we're feeling like we're saying that, then other entertainment industries are going to say, well, yeah, there are only comic books. And it's like, no, no, regardless of where we're coming from and regardless of the genre within the medium itself, we're doing great things out there. We're a valid and accepted form of storytelling, and all the big forms of storytelling that are being shot out there on TV and movies are coming from comic books these days.
Yeah, and I think this is the thing that isn't really, I don't believe anyway, it's not really hammered home enough in that. I mean, when you look at like your DC and your Marvel cinematic universes and stuff, yes, you look and you watch any of those films and that's come from comics. But I think it's a blessing and a curse because their success, to a certain extent, the general public at large, a huge base of them still believe that's all there is.
Yeah.
And that's not knocking those comics. I read those comics. I love those comics. But, it's the equivalent of like saying, I'm only picking a series because it's the first series that jumped into my head. But it's like saying, all that exists in the medium of books is Harry Potter. Do you know what I mean? Exactly. Harry Potter and the Hunger Games, and that's not knocking either franchise. I love them. I love both, but do you know what I mean? It's not knocking them, but it's effectively that's what you're saying. There's only one, there's only one or two subsets of that medium, which is nonsense. Anyone in comics knows that effectively the only genre that they don't do is limited by like your own imagination. You can do any genre that you want in comics, but yet that message doesn't still, even after how many, we've been doing GS now for like over 10 years now, and still that message hasn't got out. So where you see these shows that are adapted, the ones that I want to see them make more of a deal of are the ones which are adapted from comics that people still don't know were adapted from comics. And on the flip side of that, I was saying to Shane the other day, I've been reading the BPRD stuff. I know I've just had the Hellboy film out, but for me, unless they did it maybe animated, I can't see them doing BPRD in any form of justice compared to what they've already done in the comics.
Yeah.
So I think there's this other sort of idea that to get comics more validated, they need to be adapted into TV shows and into films. Whereas actually there's a lot of stuff which is being done in comics which is mind-bending and brilliant. And to a certain extent, having an adaptation is great because it can open it up to a different audience who wouldn't necessarily read comics or even read books for that matter,
Yeah.
But it shouldn't be at the detriment of the comic. They should both be of equal worth.
Yes. Yeah. Totally agree. I think mainstream tends to look at comic books as adaptation source material. And that comes with its own problems in itself. I mean, it's not an inherent issue, but it does devalue the medium. And the medium itself is one of the most wonderful entertainment mediums out there. And it needs to be able to stand on its own without people necessarily kind of looking at it and looking down upon it and saying, well, this is just stuff that is effectively used to increase the value of TV and movies. And it's like you talk to a person that loves The Road to Perdition, and then you go to them, hey, that's actually for the comic book, and they go, what?
Yeah.
So I mean, I feel like I kind of pretty much cheated that last question, that number 3.
I was first, I did put you on the spot somewhat, so I'll forgive that.
Thank you.
So as we round up, so obviously Deadlier Dan is launching at Comixolopia, which I believe is the beginning of June.
Yes, I think it's the 1st and 2nd of June.
Yeah. But where else can people find out more about the comic specifically and yourself?
Well, you can read more about Deadlier Dan and also pre-order it from there, and I'll also do a point of sale there as well when it's the pre-order's over at Facebook. So if you go to facebook.com/DeadlierDan, you will find it. It's pretty easy to find in Google as well, thankfully. There you can read up about some of the stories. We'll see some artwork, see some previews, and really get a good idea and good feel for the book, as well as see as Megan Bradbury's amazing, lovely cover that she did for the book, and a lot of the pinups that we were doing in the book as well by a suite of just absolutely phenomenal artists. I can be found pretty much everywhere. I have a very distinctive name. As it turns out, it looks like I'm the only Corey Brotherson on the entire internet. So if you put my name,
you're easy to search for.
Yeah, I'm like infamous essentially. So I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook. Basically putting my name in any of those, you'll find me exceptionally quickly. And given that I'll be freelancing from May and really focusing on more fiction work and other editorial work and such, my presence will probably spread out a little bit wider than normal. Because you'll probably find a little bit of my stuff on PlayStation blog as well, given that I've been working on PlayStation for so long. But yeah, you can easily find me on any social media these days, and you can find Deadlier Dan on Facebook primarily.
Well, Corey, it goes to show how much I enjoy talking to you because you've been talking for like 90 minutes. So either I'll stick this out as one episode or this will be split into 2. I'll make the decision after editing. But it's been an absolute pleasure, sir.
Thank you. Likewise, as always.
All right, then. So that's it from this week's Geek Syndicate. As always, you can contact us via the geeks at geeksyndicate.co.uk. We're on Twitter at Geek Syndicate. We're on Instagram. We're on Facebook. You know the drill. You know where to find us. And if you don't, it's going to be a fun experience to try. Anyway, we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, my name's Brian Nugent. This is Geek Syndicate. I'm out.